With us, a man who has just, in fact, released a new book called The Baron and the Bear, Rupp's Runs, Haskins Miners, and the Season That Changed Basketball Forever. He is a longtime correspondent for ABC News. He has been a part of everything. You could talk about the Vietnam War, presidential campaigns, Apollo lunar missions, and now he's a part of a historic basketball game from 1966. David Snell is joining us live on our Village and Hotline right now. And David, thanks for spending some time. And how did a guy who worked for ABC News, matter of fact, the other book you authored up is, I've got to read this too, Mike Fright, How to Succeed in Media Interviews When Mike Wallace Comes Calling. How in the world did you get from politics and that subject to wanting to dive into the 66 title game with the Baron and the Bear?
Well, Steve, it's basically the fact that I'm a basketball junkie and have been since I was in the 4th or 5th grade in Jackson, Michigan. So when I had the chance to start thinking about, what kind of book I'd like to do, I knew some guys who had been associated with that Rupp's Runs team in Kentucky. And they were telling me a number of Rupp stories, and I thought, that's an interesting thing. And then, of course, after I got into that part of the story, I started delving into the Texas Western part, and it got to be more and more interesting. So it was just the kind of thing, the kind of story that I think is most interesting to be telling is the narrative of what happened in that season.
We have seen books come out like Glory Road from Dan Wetzel, The Walls Come Tumbling Down, which came out years ago. So there's been some books, and of course, locally, some of the books that have been written by Ray Sanchez, basketball's biggest upset, that have always kind of told the story from the Texas Western standpoint. But up until your book, The Baron and the Bear, David, we really have not ever been able to go close and inside what the locker room was like at the University of Kentucky until now.
Yeah, well, that's what it seemed like to me, that the story was always either one-sided or, as when the movie Glory Road, which I thought was a good movie, but a movie has to condense things. It has to synthesize the whole year into an hour and a half or an hour and 40 minutes. And so I wanted to go inside. I wanted to have a kind of fun and funny deep dive into what was that season like, the 1965-66 season. It wasn't just the final game. It was the process that the two teams went through during the year to get to that final game. And I thought it was an interesting approach to this story that people know the ending of, but they don't know how it transpired during the year.
David Snell with us right now on our Village and Hotline talking about The Baron and the Bear, which is available now, by the way. I want to let everybody know from the University of Nebraska Press, you can get this book on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. We'll tell you about that in just a little bit. But as you mentioned, knowing you had access to Kentucky players, a lot of those players have never in the past really wanted to talk about this game or the season. I don't want to say it was a moment where they wanted to forget, but they were on the wrong side of history. Did it take you a while to try to convince some of these players to go back 50 years in time and rehash some of these memories with you?
Not really. It wasn't really that difficult because, first of all, I had an insider's look because I'd known the captain of the team, Larry Conley, for some 30 years. And while we'd never talked extensively about that, I knew about his involvement. And so Larry was interested in talking. And I also was a friend with Mike Harold, who was a student manager and had a great memory of everything that had happened that year. So getting into the Rupp's Runs side of that turned out to be a lot easier than I thought it might be. And I also got with Joe B. Hall, who was the assistant coach, first-year assistant coach for Rupp that year. And he's now 86 or 87 years old, but has an encyclopedic memory of what happened that year. So I really felt like I was getting inside that team, and I was concerned, was I going to be able to have the same kind of access on the Texas Western side? Well, that turned out to be very, very much easier than I had anticipated as well.
I heard you had a lot of help in El Paso for that, and people that were essentially putting you in touch with the family of the Haskins family and some of the players and people that are part of it to get the Texas Western background as well.
Yeah, I first got in touch with David Lappin. I came across his book, Slam Dunk to Glory, and I said, David, I'd like to talk to you. And so I went out to Houston and talked to him. And he put me in touch with Steve Trudenik, who turned out to be the player on the team the year before the championship year. And Steve had all the contact information with all the different players. So he was very instrumental in me getting inside that. I mean, the first thing that I did when I got down to Austin, Texas, where Steve lives, was he picked me up and we went to San Antonio and talked to Neville Shedd, who is a great storyteller. And the two of them sat there throughout an afternoon. It was one of my most interesting afternoons in my life because I love basketball, and these guys are great storytellers, and I felt like I was getting inside the Texas Western situation.
What was the biggest challenge for you as you were gathering all the stories and the information in putting this book together?
Well, what do you put in and what do you leave out? I mean, you cannot do every single thing that everybody tells you. As I said, there was 4 hours of wonderful information that those guys gave me that day. But it's piecing together the stories. And at first, I wasn't quite sure how I would approach the telling of the story. But as it turned out, I was able to go one chapter of Kentucky, one chapter of Texas Western, back and forth. And we watched both of them come through the season. And we get to know the players instead of a final, the final game in which you'd have to reach back to get all the information. I just decided that the best way to approach it is to follow them through the season. And there are so many anecdotes about the relationship between Coach Rupp and his team and the relationship between Don Haskins and his team that it was just fascinating to me.
It's also interesting because, as you pointed out in the early stages of the book, in the prologue, really, David, Adolph Rupp has been portrayed as the villain so many times, whether it's the movie, other stories, the fact that he didn't want to integrate his team. There probably has been a lot of misconceptions over the years about the Baron, and one of the things you really wanted to try to do in this book is set the record straight.
Well, I didn't start out to exonerate Adolph Rupp, but it turns out that I had read so much about him being a racist, and all of it seemed to point back to that one game where he didn't have any black players on his team and played against Texas Western that played only 7 black players on that night. But when I got to talking to all the players and to Coach Joe B. Hall and to people surrounding that program, I couldn't find a single person who thought that Rupp was a racist. Now, he wasn't a terribly good recruiter of black players, but he'd been trying. In fact, one of the interesting things that I came up with was that he had decided that probably he needed to get Hughes Jackie Robinson to integrate the Southeastern Conference, which, of course, had been all white forever. And so he got Branch Rickey and said, okay, what should I do? If I want to integrate this program, what should I do? And Branch Rickey gave him three different ideas. He said, first of all, you have to have a Kentucky boy, and then you have to have a boy who's a good student, and then someone you just absolutely can't leave on the bench. And so that's what he set out to do.
Well, let's put it this way. The hardest part, I'm sure, was during this time of an era of basketball. You know, it's one thing when you're Don Haskins and you're putting together the best players you can get from wherever you can find them, knowing you're in El Paso coaching at Texas Western. But when you're in the SEC and it's so high profile and you're right in the heart of the South like that in Lexington and you're Adolph Rupp, you're still trying to get the best team you can field to win another national championship because it had been a while before this game in '66 when Kentucky had last won the national championship. And I'm sure that even 50 years ago, there were a lot of people that looked at Adolph Rupp and thought that, it's time for him to call it quits and let somebody younger with a different philosophy take things over there.
Right. There were lots of newspaper stories about Rupp being a basketball anachronism. In fact, one writer said that instead of hurting the Wildcats, the Kentucky Wildcats name was the team name, instead of doing that, he should focus on his prize Angus bulls and so on. Switch animals here and give up your position as coach of Kentucky Wildcats. But Rupp was just determined. He was going to have another national championship. His last one had been 1958. In fact, in a period of a decade there, he had won 4 national championships. And at that time, long before John Wooden came along, it was just incredible that he had the winning streak that he had. So he was intent on getting that 5th national crown, and he didn't see Texas Western coming up the other side of the bracket.
What about now the game itself that was played in 1966 between UTEP and Texas Western? David, how old were you at the time of this game? I always like hearing from people, and do they remember the game? What were your recollections from the championship game in '66?
I watched the game, but I rooted for Texas Western because they were the underdog. It didn't really occur to me at the time the historic significance of that game. But I just moved to Chicago. I just joined ABC News, and I was preparing to go to Vietnam at the time. So I was, much more focused on going to Vietnam than I was in a basketball game. But that game caught my attention because there it was. The 7 players who played on Texas Western were all black, and I don't know if I thought at that moment that this is historic, but it certainly became that as the time went by.
The book again, The Baron and the Bear. We've got David Kingsley Snell, the author of the book, with us on the program right now. It is available now from the University of Nebraska Press. The book actually has a release date, a publication date of December the 1st, but thanks to the beauty of modern publishing, David, people could actually order this book now and have it from Amazon and from Barnes & Noble.
Yeah, I've always thought that was a little strange. The publishing date was December 1st. And in fact, I've talked to Nebraska Press, and I said, isn't that kind of old-fashioned? You're saying the publishing date is when it's going to be in bookstores. But as most of us know, we get our books online a lot more than we do in bookstores. In fact, I live in Atlanta, and several of the big Barnes & Noble bookstores here have gone out of business, So I think that I'm pleased that the book is out because I wanted it to come out during the basketball season, and the earlier the better. So, yeah, I'm glad that it's available from all of the sources. I mean, from Barnes & Noble, from Amazon, from University of Nebraska Press.
As you follow this season into the culmination of the championship game, one of the things you also included in this book was Frank DeFord, who covered the game for Sports Illustrated and had the write-up on the game. Tell me a little bit about Frank's post-game comments after the game was over.
Well, after the game was over, his report in Sports Illustrated that week did not include, for instance, the fact that Texas Western played only black players. It just didn't mention that. Now, the week before, he had set that up and said, that it would be a game either against Duke or against Kentucky, both of whom are all white. And so he was certainly aware of it, but for whatever reason didn't report it in his column that night. In fact, it was sometime later when people started to really be focused on the fact that it was such a historic event.
Do you think that's just because at that time people looked at this more as just a basketball game as opposed to perhaps the color of the skin that was out there on the court?
Well, it's interesting to me that when I talked to the players on both teams, they did not see race at that time. The week before, Kentucky had played University of Michigan, Cassie Russell, and his three black teammates. And so it really didn't make much difference to the Kentucky players that they were playing with against one more black player. And as far as the Texas Western players are concerned, I thought David Lattin had the line that captured it, because he said, when I'm going up for a rebound, I don't have time to think about, is this a white guy or a black guy going beside me? I'm going after the ball. So I was really somewhat surprised that at the time it wasn't regarded as such a big deal. Now, immediately afterwards, it became such a big deal. And certainly that's why we focus on that game now, 50 years later.
As far as the forward of the book, you picked Nolan Richardson, the former Texas Western player for Don Haskins and Hall of Fame coach, to write your forward. Was Nolan who you always had in mind? Tell me a little bit about your thought process that led you to call up Nolan Richardson.
Well, I thought it would be obviously important to have a black former player or a former coach, because obviously it opened the door for black players and for black coaches in a way that it had never been opened before. And I wanted to talk to Nolan because he had been on the team the year before Haskins arrived, and in fact had some interesting stories to tell about his first experience. For instance, the first day that Haskins arrived there, Nolan was there helping him unload the U-Haul, and finally Haskins said, I understand you're the high point man last year, 21 points a game. And Nolan said, yeah. And Coach said, but I also understand you can't guard a telegraph pole. And Nolan thought, what's happening here? And in the course of that conversation, Nolan Richardson became aware of the fact that he was going to have to be a heck of a defensive player to play for Coach Haskins. So I was interested in him as a storyteller about Haskins and about that early experience. And as the time went by, I thought, well, how could there be a better person to do the forward than Nolan Richardson? And when I asked him to do it, he was happy to do it, and I think it kind of set the tone for the whole book.
David, the book is 278 pages, and I'll say this. Not only do you get a great inside look into Kentucky and Adolph Rupp, but you get, without a doubt, the most documented, detailed look into Don Haskins' season that year. A lot of stories that were told, a lot of behind-the-scenes access. So you really do feel like you're going through week by week, into the 1965-66 season and the culmination of the national championship. How long did this project take you from start to finish?
Just about 3 years. I mean, from the time that I first started doing interviews until the book was available on Amazon, it was about a 3-year process. And it was a very interesting thing, because when I first started, I knew quite a bit about Coach Rupp and not very much about Coach Haskins. But what I discovered is that there were so many similarities between the two. I mean, both of them ran practices that were silent. Just the kind of thing that it appeared that the players on the teams had taken a Benedictine vow of silence, because they just didn't talk. The other thing is that both coaches were very much into repetitive drills. They do things over and over and over. In Rupp's case, it was offense. In Haskins' case, mainly defense. And the other thing is that I discovered that the players on both teams really hated their coach at the time that was all happening. I mean, so there were similarities there, and whereas the age difference, Rupp was 64 and Haskins only 36 at the time, and of course Rupp had all these national championships And Haskins was, as he described himself, as a young punk at the time. But there were those similarities. And then the big difference, I think, was that Haskins was quite comfortable recruiting. Now, Adolph Rupp wasn't interested much in recruiting even white players. I mean, it just wasn't something he was into anymore. He thought the program should do the recruiting. But Haskins, as we know from Glory Road and more detail from my book, Haskins was very comfortable in being in the homes of the black players, and he knew that he needed to get the best players he could, and fortunately for him at the time, there were an awful lot of black players who were very good who were not being recruited by the major colleges.
The name of the book, once again, is The Baron and the Bear, Rupp's Runs, Haskins Miners, and the Season That Changed Basketball Forever. David Kingsley Snell with us right now on our Village Inn hotline. You can order the book and buy it now on Amazon, on Barnes & Noble as well. And people are going to ask this, David, if we can get enough people here to cover the costs, would we be able to get you into El Paso for a book signing?
Oh, absolutely. I was down in El Paso to do some early reporting. And first of all, I had been in El Paso years ago doing a story on border security. And I swear that even though that's maybe 34 years ago, you could run that and pretty much have the same story today. It hasn't changed all that much. But I was intrigued by El Paso at the time, and I just thought, here's an opportunity to not only go there to get the story, but also to revisit El Paso. So, yeah, I'm very interested in coming down. Hope we can do that.
We'll work on trying to make that happen, and if we can, we'll definitely pass it along. But, folks, The Baron and the Bear is the name of the book. David Snell has been kind enough to join us here on the show in our 5 o'clock hour. And all I can tell you is, David, I've got into the book right now. I just got over the weekend and started it. It's a compelling read. It's going to keep me addicted till the end. And it's great because I know the ending. Yet it doesn't matter. I want to read every last detail just to get that that insight to see what it was like that year.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is interesting, and I was talking about the similarities between the coaches, and one of the similarities is that both coaches hated the zone, and Haskins never ever played a zone, and Adolph Rupp was really the inventor of the 1-3-1 zone, but what he called it was a stratified, transitional, hyperbolic, parabolic man-to-man. He just couldn't come up with the admission that, yes, he was playing a zone defense. But one of the things about that championship game is that it just didn't work against Texas Western. I mean, it was just the kind of game that Kentucky was used to running, and that wasn't Haskins' game. He played a slow, deliberate game. And so in that game, Kentucky got only one fast break. That was it. It tied the game at 3-3, and they never had a fast break again. And Mo Ibo, who was Haskins' assistant coach at the time, told me that when they got into that preparation for that game, they had decided from watching Kentucky against Duke the night before that they really didn't have to worry much about rebounds because, after all, this was Rupp's Runs. The tallest guy on the Rupp's Run starting lineup was 6'5". So that wasn't an issue. And what was an issue was that fast break. And so they wanted to drop 3 people back. They've never done that the rest of the season. But when Texas Western shot the ball, they dropped 3 people back, and it just shut the fast break off for Kentucky.
I love it. People, you're going to want the book. You're going to want to read it. And you're going to enjoy it as much as we have just in the 25 minutes we've had David on the show with us today here on the program. Until next time, David, I look forward to meeting you in El Paso, and thank you again for giving us so much time today on the program.
Great, Steve. It's good to talk to you, and I hope people do like the book because I think it does capture both teams in a way that I hadn't seen before. So I'm I'm excited to get the kind of feedback that I'm getting from people who have read the book and enjoy it.
They're going to love it. The Baron and the Bear, folks. Check it out. Rups, Runs, Haskins, Miners, and the season that changed basketball forever. You can order it right now on Amazon.com and Barnes & Noble as well.